From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden releases his budget for fiscal 2024, setting up a clash with Republicans in Congress, but perhaps more important, setting up his priorities if he runs for re-election and for 2025 if he happens to win the presidency again. We'll tell you about some of the major proposals and what they tell us about the Biden agenda. Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and I'm here with my colleagues, budget hawks extraordinaire, Kyle Peterson and Kate Batchelder-Odell. Welcome to you both. We haven't all seen the details yet because those details have just been released, but the broad outlines and the major proposals have been leaking the administration in advance. White Houses like to dribble out as much news as possible on these budgets over some days, and we've been getting some of the details. Let's just give you a little list of the tax increases, raising the corporate income tax rate to 28% from 21%. That's the statutory rate, higher than last year's 25% proposal. Raising the Medicare surtax on income from 3.8% to 5%. That's on payroll. Raising the capital gains tax rate to 39.6% from 20%. Quadrupling the 1% stock buyback tax that passed only last year. A new 25% minimum tax on billionaires, which turns out to actually be on millionaires. And that proposal was 20% last year. A new top individual tax rate to 39.6% from 37%. Raising taxes on company foreign profits. And those are just the highlights, or should I say lowlights. No doubt there are many more buried in the fine print. Taxes, taxes, and more taxes. Kate, what do you make of this list? And I guess the White House must think it's smart politics.
Yeah, Paul, it is a long list of tax increases. I think the top line picture of this budget is important. It's always noted that it's largely a political document, that Congress will put its own prints on the budget, but it is notable of the kind of direction and policy direction that the administration is going. And here we see that long new list of taxes, 21 to 28% on the corporate rate, which Republicans worked hard to bring down to 21 in tax reform in 2017. And it's important, I think, to talk about what these taxes are. You can argue about how much, but the raise in the corporate tax, the incidence of that, it falls on labor. So it's really just a wage cut. But I also think, Paul, we're seeing a willingness to raise taxes quite ferociously, but also no willingness to reduce spending. So I think we can dispense with the credulous headlines about deficit reduction. What we will see here is that we will use these tax increases, however much revenue they end up yielding, to continue Biden's spending blowout. We aren't seeing any fiscal restraint here on any domestic programs. We're talking about more money to blow out the child tax credit. We're talking about pouring billions more into childcare and other programs. And then the only real pay-fors in this budget are basically drug rationing, which is not an attractive option to solve the government's fiscal problems. So overall, Paul, I think you're seeing a budget that's a political document even more than usual, but at least does some service in showing what kind of taxes will be required to fund what Democrats would like to do.
When you say pay-fors, you mean other spending reductions, right? Because the administration would say the taxes are the pay-fors.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I'm talking about where they're willing to show some restraint. I think the taxes are a bad measure of pay-fors because they don't always yield as much revenue as expected, especially taxes on capital. And one other thing there, Paul, is one of these taxes they're talking about ratcheting up, the Obamacare investment tax. It was set up to pay for Obamacare and passed to pay for Obamacare. And now they're double marking it and going to throw it in the Medicare trust fund. So it's basically an enormous multi-billion-dollar gimmick.
At 5%, it's already 3%. So, and it's applied on investment income. So if you make money on your savings account and you make more than $400,000, you pay that surtax. And 5% is getting really, really quite steep. Now, the administration claims that none of this will hit anybody who makes less than $400,000, Kyle. But Biden's been rolling out that $400,000 number now since the campaign in 2015. And we know that inflation in 2021 and 2022 has been roaring. That 400,000 number is an index. So right now it's suddenly people who nominally make 400,000, but it's really probably now about 375 because of inflation, and it'll keep going up. And in fact, just to underscore the point that Kate made about the corporate income tax, every economist, left, right, center, says that corporations don't pay taxes. They collect them, and the incidence of the corporate tax, the literature is pretty clear. It applies and hits some mix of workers in lower wages, shareholders in lower returns, and customers in higher prices.
Yeah, and remember, one of the reasons that the Republican tax reform in 2017 lowered that corporate rate is because we were having all this talk about corporate inversions, where U.S. companies were buying a company abroad and finding it to their advantage tax-wise to locate their new headquarters in the foreign jurisdiction. And so Biden's talking about taking it back up to 28%. You can go to the Tax Foundation, find the average corporate tax rate in different regions. If it's weighted by GDP in the G20 countries, average weighted tax rate, corporate tax rate is 26.2. The G7, it's 25.8. Both of those, according to my math, less than 28%. And so if you go up to that rate again, I think you're making it disadvantageous for these companies to locate their businesses and their new factories in the United States.
May I add a point about that? There is a good analysis by Dan Clifton of the Strategas Consulting Group, which makes the point that the tax increases on business from last year that were in the Inflation Reduction Act, and because the Congress did not extend the research and development tax credit, adds up to about 3 more percentage points increase in the corporate tax rate. In effect, that would take, on top of the 28% that Biden proposed, that would take it to 31%, which would be even less competitive. And then you have to add on to that the state corporate tax rates, which varies by state, but can go as high as 8-9%. So then you're up to 40%. So this is back to making U.S. corporations much less competitive, Kyle.
Yeah, and on the point of the personal side and that $400,000 that Biden's been citing with these inflation figures, obviously we know that year after year, if that's his target and it's not adjusted for inflation, that will take in more people. On a similar point, my favorite part about this from Biden's framing standpoint is his minimum income tax on billionaires, which, according to the terms, is not an income tax. It's more like a wealth tax because it would apply to unrealized capital gains, unsold stock, unsold art collections, and so forth, and also is not on billionaires because he's targeting it to people who I think are over 100 million in assets. And so, even beyond the deceptive framing on that, I think there's a constitutional issue of whether the U.S. federal government can even tax an unsold asset like that. But I just think that Kate hit the point right on the head, which is this is being pitched as he's raising taxes, he's lowering the deficit, but we're already not paying for the government that we have. And Biden wants to layer on top of that his whole Build Back Better agenda that he hasn't given up. I mean, I went to the Office of Management and Budget historical tables and printed them out here as one does. This is the life that we have chosen. And in terms of the economy, gross domestic product, the high in federal tax receipts since World War II was 20% in the year 2000. And spending already, again, with the government we have, 31% in 2020.
That's pandemic.
That's pandemic years. But even before that, 2019, 21%. It's above 20 all the way back to 2007. And so we're not paying for the government that we already have.
It was 24.8% in 2022, the last fiscal year, okay? 24.8%. Biden isn't going to cut that.
Right, exactly. We are not paying for the government we have. We have this Social Security and Medicare crisis coming down the pike. And here we are talking about President Biden's new plan for universal paid child care and down payment subsidies and whatnot.
Well, I want to talk about growth here. And I don't want to bore people with green eye shades numbers, although, again, I tend to do that. But let's talk about the economy, all right, and impact on the budget. What we have here, I think, Kate, is extraordinary. You have the President of the United States who is looking at an economy this year that has been remarkably resilient in the face of Federal Reserve rate increases. But nearly every economist I know is predicting a slowdown in growth just because of that interest rate effect. And his budget is going to slap it, if it passed, with all of these tax increases following the tax increase last year, even in the most Keynesian terms. That is the favored Democratic economic model. Keynesian model says in the teeth of a recession, you don't raise taxes to reduce demand. And he's proposing that. So he's fortunate that the Republicans on Capitol Hill are not going to pass these tax increases. But it is really something to see a Democratic president proposing this and then touting it as supposedly having some kind of growth effect for the economy.
Yeah, Paul, and I just note, even if Congress doesn't pass these enormous tax increases, it's still a message to investors that taxes are going one way, and that is up. I think that is really a core takeaway of this document, is how committed the left is to raising taxes, despite the damage that you lay out. I mean, we talk about green eye shades and our own budget nerd interests here, but growth is important to pretty much every area of the federal government. I mean, Biden is proposing a plan that he says will shore up Medicaid, when in reality it doesn't reform the entitlement. But growth matters for our ability to fund our entitlement programs, and how hard those are going to be to fix in the end when the crisis eventually comes. And it will be interesting to even see what the president says he expects growth to be over the next decade in the budget. I also think we can talk a little bit more later in this about his defense budget, but economic revitalization really matters also to America's standing in the world. So to have a world that's getting more dangerous, what seems like could be a looming slowdown, and then to propose these large tax increases that will just dampen growth on the economy. And last point would be to mention, we have shown no seriousness about making serious reform to our arcane permitting processes or other things that are dampening capital investment. This is not a good picture. This is not a sign that America is going to be revitalized anytime soon.